Now we start the second panel, and with our guest speaker, Professor Brahma Prakesh. Uh, Please come and join me on the table. Thank you. Better. Thanks. So I'll quickly introduce Professor Brahma Prakash. He is a writer, a cultural theorist, and an assistant professor of theater and performance studies at the School of Art and Aesthetics at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. He is the author of critically acclaimed books, Cultural Labor, Conceptualizing the Folk Performance in India. It was published by Oxford. Please come rakhiye volume. Thank you. Oxford University Press in 2019. And another very interesting book, Body on the Barricades, Life, Art and Resistance in Contemporary India. This was published by LeftWord in 2023. It's a very recent book. And it's a very interesting book. I haven't read the whole book, but I had heard his speech, his talk on that and the introduction, which is quite fascinating. So strongly recommended. Please go for that book and check it out. He has also published in various research journals, including Performance Research, South Asian History and Culture, in the Economic and Political Weekly, and many others. His opinions have also appeared in the BBC, Aljazeera, New Arab, Print, and other popular podcasts in Hindi and English. So today he is going to talk about, he had given us this topic, possibility from the points of curtailment. And a brief idea that we had discussed, which he had shared with me about what he's going to intervene with. Rest I'll leave to him after that. That is, barriers and distances are usually considered limiting in their dimensions. However, they also remain a major influence for artistic and creative works. Between the limits of barriers and distances and possibilities of creativity in the limited space, he will explore the dimensions of possibility from these points of curtailments, right? And once again, there are some new people here, so the rule here is, if you don't understand anything, please stop us, ask. If you don't understand the language, please stop us, ask, we'll translate. तो हिंदी में जिसको अगर किसी को समझ में नहीं आए तो प्लीज़ पूछ लीजिएगा आराम से, हम लोग हिंदी में भी बीच में ट्रांसलेट कर देंगे. और अगर कोई और लैंग्वेज है और ट्रांसलेट हो सकी फ्रॉम अमंगस्ट आवरसेल्व्स तो वो भी हो जाएगा, राइट? सो थैंक यू फॉर बीइंग हियर एंड ओवर टू यू नाउ.
Yeah. So thank you, Parvez, for inviting me. Also thanks Premjis and all the team members who are organizing this really fascinating series of talk and exhibition that is going to open on 3rd. So I think I don't know how to proceed now because Santosh had made such a thorough kinds of proposition and very, I will say, radical proposition that after that it becomes difficult that how you're going to arrange your thoughts and things. And I almost forgot that what I suggested to Parvez that time. And that time it was about thinking about possibilities from the push situation. And that has been the work that I've been doing. That was also part of Body on the Barricades, where I was writing this book in the height of the COVID, and there was a whole situation of hopelessness everywhere. So you talk to your friends, you talk to your family members, you talk to your comrades, you talk to your other people, and there was a whole situation of hopelessness that was prevailing in that kinds of situation. But at the same time, how to think about some kinds of hope in that kinds of difficult situation. And therefore, when Parvez suggested me that he's doing something on of barriers and distances, then I was thinking about barriers in other way around. Barriers, whenever you are thinking about barriers, then it becomes barriers in a more limiting ways. It is the things that limits your capacity. It is the things that somewhere also obstruct your kinds of again movement and all those things. So is there a possibility to think about barriers in other way around? And that would be kinds of proposition that work that I have been doing, and I will also try to reflect here. Same, so 3 things. I'm going to talk about largely 3 things. One, that would be about talking about one, that how to talk about this whole idea about barriers in which so one that is very much in a limiting way. So either we are talking about caste society, either we are talking about racial society or gendered society. We know that there are a lot of barriers everywhere, and that one can talk about those barriers. Second possibility would be that thinking about barriers in a very minor scales, that we don't pay attention to. So for example, the first thing I remember that in my life, that border, where I heard the border. Before I heard about India-Pakistan border or American or China border, I heard border when my sister and mother used to make sweaters, and they will say that ki border bana rahe hain. वो बॉर्डर बनाते थे. तो पहले बिफोर दे स्टार्ट मेकिंग स्वेटर, दे विल क्रिएट द बॉर्डर्स, एंड दैट वाज द फर्स्ट टाइम आई रिमेंबर दैट आई हर्ड अबाउट देयर इज समथिंग बॉर्डर. सो यू क्रिएट अ बॉर्डर बिफोर you participate in these kinds of creativity. Same way barriers, when I talk about the barriers, and then you also have a lot of terms. So for example, how you're going to translate barriers or borders in Hindi, and then you have bara, वो बोलते हैं सुअर बारा, गाय बारा, तो उसमें बाड़ा है उसमें, but again you are talking about some kinds of barriers, some kinds of things that that is very much there. So talking about those so how we are going to pay attention, we necessarily need to pay attention to minor borders that we don't pay attention to. And I think for me that becomes kinds of very specific sites of mobilization against the big border that we can talk about. So during the farmers protest, you have Baga border that came up, you have Singhu border that came up. That was the border that had a very different kinds of features, that has a very different kinds of quality, and that was going against the very hegemonic idea of the border that we keep talking about. So is there a borders or barriers that we can take in a different way, that we can talk in a more different way and different skills? And third would be that very obvious choice, that talking about some kinds of possibility from those barriers and borders in that way. I would like to read out some parts, and again, we'll go to have dialogue in some parts that way. So, of course, I'm not here to introduce you to barriers, borders, or barricades. They have already been introduced, and they are very much there. They are so much there in all scales, in all forms, in all sizes, visible and invisible, marked and unmarked, barriers in the forms of walls, fences, ghettos, merits, aesthetics, class, caste, gender, race, beauty, and so on, that we can talk about. There are barriers that we carry in our bodies, in our bones, in our words and imagination. They are inside and outside. We realize it when we limp, when we jump, when we try to move and walk. So the question of barriers and distances for me also about points and patterns of solidarity. So how we are going to talk about barriers in a more different way, from different kinds of positionality. So one way of talking about so patterns of solidarity. So not necessarily seeing the barriers from barriers outside that is there, but seeing barriers from the points of solidarity, other side. Seeing barriers from your limping, seeing barriers from your jumping, seeing barriers from your movement, seeing barriers from your bodies. And some of the photographs that was there, I think that can be another possibility about thinking about barriers, because barriers gives you a very visible kinds of picture that is there. But again, how there can be another perspectives in which we can talk about barriers, not necessarily reflecting on the barriers, but reflecting on our own imagination in our own bodies and from different kinds of positionality. And that is what I would like to propose here. So we are precisely talking about political anatomy. When we talk about barriers and when we talk about these kinds of distances, then we are talking about political anatomy. And you have Fanon, Franz Fanon, he writes a lot about, in all his writings, sometimes this barriers comes in, some kinds of politics becomes some kinds of part of physiognomy. Politics becomes some kinds of part of the corporeality, and then corporeality not necessarily coming from the barriers point of view, but from the body points of view, from other sides. So barriers and distances should also bring apparently innocent activities of walking and standing, seeing and seeking. It reminds me of the works that recently came. It's by Matthew Bumo. It's called How We Walk. How we walk itself reflects on the barriers. So it is not about how women walk in our society, how lower caste walk in our society, how if you're talking about racialized society, how they walk in their society. And I think that says a lot about the barriers that we see and we don't try to see. No, thank you. So barriers have been erected in the mind of people from which vantage point you want to see the barriers. I would propose that instead of seeing barriers and distances outside, we should also see, I'm not saying that necessarily one should see from this point only, we should also start seeing barriers in postures, in gaits, in a standing, in our eyes, in the manifested symptoms of alienation and oppression. Bumo calls it a compartment. The term he is using, interesting term he is using the term compartment. It refers to the manner in which the body carries itself. So how body carry itself makes some kinds of comment on barriers outside, and therefore it is already something is already internalized. Because if you are seeing barriers outside, then perhaps you are missing that points. But if you are seeing from this side, then there is a possibility to talk about that how body is carrying itself, and that becomes one point of gauging on the questions of barriers and distances. But it is also about the ways in which the body endures itself. Instead of looking for the barriers, look for the bodies. In other words, bodies are repository of barriers too. So when we are talking about body, and then how body becomes the repository of barriers too. Finding barriers is about seeing body in its fundamental immobility. Drawing from Fanon, Bumo says, and he remarks that walking like breathing is supposed to be a natural, a spontaneous activity, but as Fanon repeatedly demonstrated in his work, it is in fact a cultural and historical activity, one that is determined, shaped by racial and colonial politics of capitalist society. What are the terms for barriers in Indian language? So you have bard, that's the example I was giving, bara or bard, and jehani bandis. It is also called interesting translation of this barrier is jehani bandis. माने बंदिश जो कि बाहर नहीं दिखता है लेकिन आपके ख्याल में बंदिश बना दिया गया है कि आप सोच ही नहीं सकते बाहर जाने के लिए अगर रात में आपको बाहर जाना है तो you cannot think about going out. So that has been very much part of the very internalized kinds of barriers that we have been part of this. Jehani Bandi. So Jehani is Jehani is part of some kinds of imagination, but it's also Jehani is some kinds of corporeal also. Corporeal that you have already internalized, and imaginative that you have already internalized. It's called Jehani Bandis. And the terms for barriers are also Bandis. In music, we use the term Bandis. So many times when I'm talking about some kinds of possibilities of possibilities from barriers, then we can talk about some kinds of musical formation in Indian context. So बंदिश वर्ड्स को कैप्चर किया जाता है. You are trying to give a shape to the words. You are trying to encircle the words, and in through the that kinds of encirculation or circulation, you are able to create some kinds of music, and therefore again it generates some kinds of possibilities where how barriers and how surrounding, how some kinds of encircling can also create some kinds of possibility of artistic creativity. But yeah, so we have term. And Hindi, Urdu is called Jehani Bandis, and so on. Barriers produce distorted and many times cramped bodies. Like if we are talking about body, barriers, then barriers also produce a lot of cramped and distorted bodies. Many times, the way I work on Natya Shastra, Indian dramaturgical text, and Indian dramaturgical text, you have a lot of examples. I will read one part where it says that how women should walk, how lower caste should walk, how other people should walk. So it gives you a pattern of walking. But what is this pattern of walking we are talking about? Necessarily, there are barriers that have been created in terms of walking itself, and therefore, when we are talking about movement not necessarily remain innocent part of the politics that one can talk about. But again, Fanon would also talk about the militant possibilities of deformed bodies. So when I'm talking about, is there a possibility to talk from the pushed point of view? And is there a possibility when you are in a completely hopeless situation? So is there a possibility to think about some kinds of hope? Because there would be two kinds of when I'm saying that okay, points of possibility from the points of curtailment, then one can easily translate it. आपदा में अवसर ढूंढना, वो अभी हमारे यहाँ स्लोगन है. So you are trying to look for some opportunity in kinds of dire kinds of situation. But again, no, this is coming from very neoliberal kinds of framing, very politics of optimism. When I'm talking about generating some kinds of hope or excavating some kinds of hope from the points of curtailment, then I'm talking about hope where hope is so how to think about these kinds of hope that I'm talking about. And then I would say that we don't have privilege not to have hope. one way of thinking about hope, that you have a lot of privileges, so you can have a hope. But here in this kinds of push situation, you don't have privilege not to have hope. You necessarily have to have hope to have create life, to create artwork, or to create like another possibility. So there are barriers that set the standards, the barriers that create structures, barriers that run the traffic, barriers that run the government, barriers that we realize and do not realize, named and unnamed barriers simultaneously, some barriers that we see and see them so much that we lose their sense of seeability. We don't see, because many times you are constantly seeing that barriers, then you lose the capacity to see, like its capacity to seeing itself. As touch is becoming a new interface of technology, there is a fear that we lose their tactility soon. As artists, as writers, as activists, how do we make them appear? Then the how we can talk about the politics of barrier. So how we are going to make it appear? Not only appear that is outside, but how we are going to make it appear through the bodies, through the movement, through the internalized conditions that we have inherited and inheriting several times. The politics is not only counter and in counter of barrier also, but it's also about how to make barriers appear and how to create barriers many times. And when I'm saying that how to create barriers, then as an artist, as a writer, you are also trying to go to the edge. You are trying to push yourself to that kinds of boundaries. And then necessarily you are trying to also problematize that kinds of a sphere in which I think barriers can also appear. And therefore, in this scenario, we necessarily need to talk about what Bimo calls orthopedic politics. So when I'm talking about barriers, barrier is necessarily barriers and distancing, both the terms for me evoke some kinds of sense of orthopedic politics, because orthopedic is a condition, but when we are talking about orthopedic politics, we are necessarily talking about some kinds of movement, some kinds of rhythm, some kinds of curtailment of the bodies itself, and therefore from some kinds of corporeal politics, we need to also talk about orthopedic politics here. That is, how does the body perform or simply prevail under the condition of exploitations? The politics of barriers and distance are also about how we walk, how we are made and supposed to walk. Barriers and distances are ultimately about corporeal organization of body and lives. And therefore, when we are talking about barriers and distance, then how we are going to radicalize these two concepts, two categories. That is one, barriers, and another is distances, because both have been a very interesting sides of creativity, because you have a lot of poetry, lot of if you are thinking about migrant communities, I come from Maghi Bhojpuri region, and therefore distance has created so much artwork. All the songs you are going to talk about, it is all about distance, and but again that distance is able to create the kinds of possibilities of the songs, possibilities of the artwork that I think one can only produce in that kinds of condition. So I'm not trying to again romanticize that curtailment, but at the same time, is there a possibility where curtailment is able to produce something that remains very specific and subjective to that kinds of condition that no other can produce perhaps. So barriers and distances ultimately, so therefore how to talk about barriers and distances in terms of corporeal organization of body and lives. Now I would like to read out that so how I'm trying to think about curtailment, barriers is a sign of curtailment in a larger kinds of canvas. So how I will read out some parts from Body on the Barricades to give you a sense that how barricades can also create a kinds of possibilities. Of course, when we talk about barricades, then it becomes a very allegorical figure. In European context, when we talk about barricades, then it becomes an emblem of revolution. But if you're talking about barricades in our contemporary kinds of politics, then we generally talk about barricades in terms of police barricades, and therefore we don't see that kinds of possibilities. So I would like to read out some part from the book to give you a sense that how barricades also becomes a sides of possibilities. Curtail movement create choreography patterns. They enter the bones and become part of muscle memory. Sometimes keeping bodies on the barricades, sometimes hiding behind the barricades, they learn to walk. Caste society has produced perhaps the most conscious act of walking in Indian society for women and outcasts. One must be aware of social status while walking. They not only define the social rules, they also govern the aesthetic rules. The Indian aesthetic text, the example I was giving, and I would like to quote here, the Indian aesthetic text, the Natya Shastra, prescribes how the lower castes and women should walk. What should be the gaits of the lowly people? And it says, I am quoting from Natyasastra, persons of inferior worth are to walk with eyes looking around. Again to repeat, persons with inferior worth are to walk with eyes looking around, protecting their limbs from the contact of other people. The restrictions are marked, embodied. Now this is my proposition. Restrictions are embodied. Movements are marked in relation to the social position. They are marked in temple walls, instilled in schools, installed in institutions. They are in social codes, in the walks, gates, and grids. And therefore, we can talk about various spheres of barriers, different spheres of barriers, where barriers are curtailing the movements, where barriers are becoming restrictions. They carry the internalized prescription in their eyes. And it is said in our society, at least I can talk about North Indian society, they will stare at you. It is always said in all the household, it is said to the women that they will stare at you, but keep your eyes low. To repeat, they will stare at you, but keep your eyes low. The curtailment of movement has slowly cut the bone. They limp when they walk, they cripple when they move, they cannot stand properly. And therefore, we also need to talk about the politics of upright. Like, when we talk about a standing, like, greeting, and all the things that, like, you can see that how the body operates, how the body carries itself, and that determines all different sense of barriers and distances that perhaps we carry in our societies. So it breaks the backbone every day. They have been walking a curtail walk. What you are seeing are not always sexy curves. It cannot be a curved, it can be a curved body in sexual codes, like the Chinese foot binding that produces a lotus foot. So in China, there was a practices of lotus, they will, so there was a whole notion of binding your feet. And in the binding of feet, they will say that, oh my God, your feet appear like a lotus. But again, that whole curved and curtailed movement that women is supposed to produce, that generally don't used to be discussed as a part of aesthetics. While the woman cries in pain, lotuses spring from her every step for the connivers. In the name of art and tradition, appreciation and objectification go together. So now coming back to, because one of the ways of thinking about barriers is barricade. Barriers can be different kinds of forms. But again, one way of thinking about very negative connotation of barriers. Other way of talking about barricades, about you have this whole idea of the insurgent barricade. That barricade produce a lot of things that we are seeing today in terms of technology, in terms of movement, that everything's are getting curtailed or scaled to that level. But is there a possibility to create some kinds of insurgent barricades? And therefore, is there a possibility to talk about, and this is an open question that I'm putting here for discussions, is there a possibility to talk about some kinds of insurgent barriers, where from the points of barriers, you can create enormous possibilities. And you have scholars like Argentinian scholars, Veronica Gago. She will use the two terms. She's talking about potencia and potential. She says that when we talk about potential, potential largely comes from the authorities. It comes from the power. But when we talk about potentia, then potentia is the power that you are also not aware of. What happens in these kinds of curtail condition, and we have many examples, that when you participate in that kinds of resistance, when you participate in that kinds of protest, when you go through that kinds of suffering and experiences, then the body and imagination also produce some kinds of capacity that you yourself were not aware of. So how to talk about potentia in these kinds of condition? And I think for this, for artists, for creative person, it becomes really many times necessity to talk about these two kinds of conditions. So it is about the body resisting, so we'll go another part. Yeah, it is about also some reflections on distance, that how we are going to talk about distance. Is it about 2 plus 2 is 4? Or are we talking about some different kinds of distance? When we say, when Nathan said that, okay, please maintain social distance in a caste society, in a racialized society, then what does it mean? So is it just about some kinds of mathematical calculation we are talking about, or we are talking about some kinds of psychology of distancing itself? So there is no denying that ideology of barricade has been shaping our ways of seeing. One day it was walking with us, constantly interfering with our movements. It was reversing everything that society has achieved after long struggle, including various rights and access to institutions. Then the authority and its ideology came to distances. Everyone was a dangerous subject. A distance have to be maintained. The distance was not only a spatial and durational here, but also about reformulating the very axis of distance itself. So when we are talking about distance now, and when one used to talk about distance maybe 20 years back, how the notion of distance perhaps have changed after COVID. And therefore, like we also need to talk about the how distance becomes a more a kinds of allegory many times, the way distance, like the way barricades also appeared as allegory, and barriers can also appear as allegory here. So it was the assumed distance where 2 and 2 color could become 4. In this new regimentation, 2 and 2 could become infinite, more than 6 at a level. 6 feet is not the size of the body, but the new minimum and lower limit that has to be maintained if you're talking about the body politics, both in its distance and after death in graveyard. It is about the size, it is about laying siege on the body and imagination. It is about the bodies on the barricades, the way I try to describe here. Now the borders, like how borders are getting reconstituted here, and therefore we need to have a different notion of border. So nation, and especially I'm talking about India here, so nation obsessed with the Wagah and Atari border with Pakistan came to know about the Singhu, Tikri and Gazipur borders of Delhi, the border that exist but are not recognized, the borders that separate the classes but are not seen, the caste borders that remain at large, the borders that divide the village and the city, the invisible borders of the CCTV cameras and security infrastructure, the borders surrounding the parliament where people are not allowed to enter. The protest made them all visible many times. Cracks opened up. What else became visible is that national boundaries are not the map of a nation. Borders are there in the forms of cracks, rifts and leaks in the field, in the cracked hills of the farmers. The hill holds many maps together, more complex than map of a nation. So is there a possibility to think about borders that is part of the cracked hills of the farmers, how we are going to read that borders as a part of that kinds of activities? Other things about talking about 2-3 examples that we have started very interestingly. We have started with the, I asked Parvez that how you came with this idea of the barriers, and he said that when he was in Switzerland, then it's about the language. So I would like to give 2-3 examples here to talk about some kinds of possibilities about barriers and that how language barriers can operate in a quite different ways. So I remember that one professor and one laborer from the almost same location, they went to learn Arabic. And I know the professor. I don't know the laborer who went to that, But professor was saying, so both went to work in, I think maybe Dubai or Abu Dhabi somewhere. And when they came back after 6 months, then this person, the worker, was talking almost like fluent Arabic. And the professor could only write few words. And now that, so I'm not saying that again, the point is not to also romanticize this idea, but how some kinds of push situation. And you will learn this one, that you're going to see the workers in many parts of India also, the way they acquire the language. The way they, because it becomes some kinds of very existential kinds of things. So I have also learned Chinese language. When I was learning in Delhi, in JNU, then it was very difficult for me. It was just a kind of lesson that you are learning. Then I went to Taiwan, and I was the remotest part of Taiwan. So for everyday survival, you need to have that language. And then the learning becomes some kinds of different kinds of ball game. And then I could realize that how the language barriers can also work in 2 different ways, and how we are interacting with the language. Because many times one that we also have some kinds of hesitancy to not to learn the language, and sometimes it also becomes some kinds of barriers that we have also created in our own mind and imagination. Second example is about Habib Tanvir. Many of you must be familiar with his work. Habib Tanvir was a famous Indian theater practitioner, and then he was quite old. I think must be around 80 or 70 plus. And then there was a program, he came to the program, and then he was talking, he was giving some kinds of birthday anniversary talk and things like that. And then he said that I want to have dictatorship, I want to have authoritarianism. And then the whole audience was completely shocked. You have a talk where this person who is considered very progressive, very kind of model figure of progressive theater, and suddenly he's saying that he would like to have authoritarianism, he would like to have dictatorship. And then he used to have a habit of taking long pause. So almost the pause was 2 minutes long. And in the meantime, it was whole rumor in the hall that he has got senile, he big gaya, sold out, sab kuch ho gaya. And so I can do my theater. After a long pause, he said, so I can do my theater. So I would like to have dictatorship, I would like to have authoritarianism, so I can do my theater. And then he's explaining that can you think about theater without dictatorship? Can you think about theater without these kinds of authoritarian figures? Theater will be so boring. I cannot do that kinds of theater. It would be too boring to do theater and artwork if you have that kinds of flatness of the society, that everything is becoming so flat that you don't have barriers, you don't have restrictions, you don't have censorship. And therefore, when I'm talking about thinking from that kinds of push situation or that kinds of barricaded position, then I'm talking about some kinds of insurgent idea of the barriers, insurgent idea of the barricades, where some artwork or that kinds of radical artwork can only happen in that kinds of scenario. So think about all the big epics, perhaps I will say, in the world that has remained in a feudal time, in a very feudal kinds of culture. I don't think we can produce those kinds of, because that happened in a very specific context with some kinds of curtailment. So how artist is going to work? One, that you don't want to have barriers. You don't want to have barriers. You don't want to have barricades. You don't want to have curtailment. But at the same time, you also have hidden desire to have barriers. You also have a hidden desire to have some kinds of some kinds of obstructions so you can cross, some kinds of border to have you want to cross. So I think it's a dilemma of barriers. Here it becomes some kinds of dilemma, some kinds of paradox in which artists have to necessarily operate. I cannot make the same kinds of comments for political activists. I may not make the same kinds of comments for maybe social scientists, but for artists to work necessarily have to create some kinds of barriers. And it's a paradox and some kinds of allegory of the barriers, or some kinds of this paradox of the barriers through which I think one can generate that kinds of possibilities. So maybe I will stop it here and we'll take some questions, and if there is a necessity, I will come back.
Hello. Yeah. So is this okay? Sound? Thank you so much for placing barriers and distances in this very interesting way and bringing up. Yes, yes, please.
Yeah, so the way I was thinking about barriers for artistic activities and for creative activities. So barriers usually carries a negative connotation. Therefore, a movement without barriers. We have almost neoliberal kinds of slogan that okay, we want campus without barriers, life without barriers, society without barriers. So it is producing some kinds of very positivistic idea of life. So you have flow without obstructions, love without risk. That you have love without risk, life without illness, artist without censorship. So B, I think, so what is happening, circulation without boundaries are not only progressive slogans, but inherently also carry the seeds of positivist thinking. And I'm afraid of this kinds of positivist thinking or very positivist kinds of articulation, that life without barriers, artist without censorship, and all those kinds of slogans. And therefore, when I'm talking about, so I'm not trying to defend the barriers, but I'm trying to create some kinds of paradox of the barriers that only barriers can produce for the life of artist and artwork. Another way of thinking about barriers is positing it against something a smoothness. So life should be a smooth, art should be a smooth, and all those kinds of. So while we do not want barriers, we cannot think about radicality of art without barriers, without the risk that threatens the life of artist, but give new birth to the life, to the art, sorry. So to repeat, sorry, we do not want barriers, we cannot think about radicality of art without barriers, without that risk that threatens the life of artists, but give new birth to the life of art. Thank you so much.
So, uh, quite an interesting way of looking at barriers and turning them around almost. If there are any questions, we can go straight away into that, or any comments, questions, I would rather. Anyone? Okay. Till you think, I can. Yeah. What you said in the end, this idea of insurgent barriers, which you also brought up throughout, and that because there would be barriers or something to overcome, art comes out of it, or one can think out of the box. I think, or one can it kind of triggers creativity in terms of how to overcome it. And as you were summing it up, I was thinking of one of my very, very favorite plays by Brecht, which is Leben des Galilei, Life of Galileo, where there is a when Galileo apologized to the church. So in that play, there's this chapter where Galileo, after he has apologized to the church, he walks. This is the scene that he walks back into his house, where his daughter, who was praying that he would apologize and will be pardoned, is very happy, and his three students who are in this room, they were, before they heard the announcement that he has apologized, they were fervently arguing amongst themselves that we know Galileo will never apologize because he has spoken the truth and he has always shown us. We are the witness to his experiments. We know that Earth is not the center of universe. So he builds this up, and then the announcement happens that he has apologized. And then Galileo enters, and all these three students are very, very disappointed. And two of them were quiet, but Andrea, who was his favorite or the closest student, because he apparently was with him from a very young age, he was very angry. And in the play, not in the real life, but Brecht places him in this position that he does not look at Galileo. He is very angry, and he says this famous line, "Unfortunate is the land that has no hero." And then it takes a pause and he's about to exit, and then Galileo responds to him in this scene very calmly, and he says, "No, Andrea, unfortunate is the land that needs a hero," right? And so when you were talking about this, the idea that if we have a barrier and if that is required, whatever kind of obstacles to produce art, then I mean, I'm trying to place this question to you. How do you look at these two contradictions? Because in this idea, it should be a society where you don't need, firstly, the barrier or a trigger to do that. And secondly, as in Santosh's thing we heard earlier, the idea of art in itself, which is a recent production of the idea of how we are creating art. And before that, and even in some of the indigenous societies, art was a function of daily life. So it was not something which was an individualistic act of said producing products, which you were also pointing out. So how do you look at and place it in this situation?
Yeah, so thank you so much. Yeah, so in fact, yeah, this becomes that is what I will say. This can become a kind of like artist dilemma through which artists work, and I think artists would like to work because necessarily, ideologically, you want not to have barriers. You want to have like things without barriers. But how can you can work without barriers? Like if there is no barriers, like then how you are going to work, and that would be a kind of very interesting challenge to pose. And I think one that like context that Santosh has already provided, that how art itself is a very new kinds of dimensions, new kinds of opening that is coming with new kinds of like perhaps like different kinds of encounters. But even if you're going back to the ritual kinds of society, ritual society, or society where like ritual was like predominant kinds of cultural production, then you will see that key even the crisis is not there, the society will create this perpetual crisis in the time of year. So you have a lot of like anthropologists, like colonial anthropologists going to Africa and those parts of the world and seeing that, oh my God, these people are so backward, like these people are so backward. Every 6 months they create some kinds of fight. They keep quarreling each other. But that was a very like a staged kinds of like a staged kinds of ritual production that you are trying to create to again either to heal the society or to like face the upcoming challenges. Hmm. So I think that like those are structure like either we are talking about of course like one parts of like art that we can find ritual and that those kinds of practices, but I think if you're thinking through that kinds of liminal dimension of artwork and ritual work, then I think that dimension remains very much there, that you create barriers, you create crises to resolve that crisis, and that is the way ritualists used to work, and that is the way precisely like I think artists is also working, and that I see the parallel in which one can think about that how this like barriers that we are thinking about is not new in that way. Another example that I will give from my own work, cultural labor. So what happens? So for example, because when we are talking about barriers, then we are also talking about some notion of center and periphery, because the distance is very much there, and distance is largely, you cannot think about distance without center or periphery, idea of the center and periphery, or at least for the 2 pointers that we can talk about. This is the way we talk about distance. So so now you are talking about, when we talk about center, when we talk about European centers and maybe Arab peripheries and that way, or maybe Delhi the center and village is the periphery. But if you're thinking about that, how the centers and periphery were getting constructed in those kinds of ritual and some kinds of cultural practices, then every year somebody is going to do some kinds of what we say, in our parts of Bihar, it's called Bhunya Puja, or land worship ceremony. So this time, my family is supposed to do the Bhunya Puja, then my house is becoming the center, all other houses are becoming periphery. From all, next time somebody is doing to go to worship river is becoming the center, your house is becoming the periphery. So there was a whole dynamic interplay of center and periphery that was working, but again with the all contradictions, and therefore with the all kinds of sense of the barriers. So not necessarily, and even if you're thinking about some kinds of ritual actions, then I think there was a sense of barriers that was already working there, and that is the way ritual is to organize the society. Ritual is to regulate the society, because before the state came it was the ritual that is to be the kinds of mechanism of law and legality. Yeah, thank you.
Anyone else with any questions? Any? Yes, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. And good to see you, Parvez, almost after 12 years. So I am an ex-JNU. So one went to JNU. So no, I went to JNU in the times, not in the present times. That was years ago. And I suppose that helps me to reconnect even after 12 years to Parvez's talk and discussions. So heartiest congratulations on whatever you've been doing in various spaces, breaking down barriers of all kinds, doing pop-up food shows to God knows what all. So I have been, I'm here today because of him, not because so much of the talk, but very interesting. Parvez also has been an activist, mental health activist. He's a practitioner. He's specialized as a psychiatrist too. So I was thinking about, because I'm emerging from a scenario of where barriers were needed as a caregiver with patients. And I had 3 elderly patients, and 2 of them had Alzheimer and dementia. And I learned how barriers could be protective, not to imprison your patients who were clueless to move around. The word you used, bada, that has a negative connotation, but we needed those badas, we needed those little things that you do in even to keep a child safe at home, so that the child doesn't fall, so the elderly doesn't fall, or the the handles that the elderly, the grab bars everywhere, so that they don't fall again, or the walkers which would encircle them and keep them safe. I was told by one of these doctors, and this is merely an observation by that if your father goes wandering in the night, so you have kept all the doors locked, maybe you could try painting doors on various walls, and that becomes a deterrent, and he doesn't get further restless when he can't actually open a door. And can we do something about it? And I saw videos of how to paint doors on walls, false, false barriers. My doctor told me as a caregiver that where are your healthy boundaries with your father or your mother-in-law? Why are you always closeted with them to give them solace? Where are your boundaries? That was the first time that I learned how to draw healthy boundaries. Now, I'm talking about boundaries in a very different manner. It's about defense mechanisms. It's not only about stopping the other, but stopping yourself. for greater good, because you are needed for a situation even later. That was one. The other is, for last many years, we have been trying to negotiate spaces between boundaries of all kinds, said and unsaid, in our workspaces, due to COVID, in our home spaces, where we were thrown in the deep end together. Um, uh, my husband was traveling for long. He comes back home because of COVID. Otherwise, he didn't need to really come back home, and he realizes he doesn't have any spaces at home anymore, any dedicated space. We have taken over. So, and he cannot go out. So we are all imprisoned. And how do we make meaning of that? Or if you are imprisoned in a workspace where you are gradually silenced or gagged for obvious reasons, against for defense mechanisms, how do you find your way? Because you have to move, the water has to flow, it has to find space. Your creativity goes away. So there is no resurgence happening. People are wilting because they can't find spaces to negotiate. You talked about Galileo. I was reminded of Socrates speaking to Plato. And he says, all your followers love you. You don't have to drink that hemlock. You have been kept inside a prison. So we will help you. Run tonight. So Socrates tells him, and I think everybody knows this. He says, if I run away from this prison, people will stop having faith in me. I would rather be inside and drink that hemlock, because they would know I died for truth. These were the stray things that came to my mind. I was listening to you. Thank you.
So, are there any further comments or questions or thoughts which somebody wants to share? Or
Yeah, so when I wrote this book called Body on the Barricades, then like in the first book discussion, I got a kind of very pertinent criticism. And it was like, coming for a person who was like, differently abled person, and make a very like, very nice, very concise comment that when you're talking about barricade, have you also thought about my movement, or like movement in which we are located? But because generally what happens that like, now since I don't want to give reference to JNU, but again, that whole landscape is so uneven many times. And then you have like very normal and able body, and they will talk about beauty of the campus. Oh my God, campus is so beautiful. And this person make a very pertinent comment that have you tried to thought about this campus from my position or my movement? And then I feel that like so for me, barriers and barricades are everywhere whenever I try to move, and then I feel everywhere, barriers everywhere. But again, as being a normative kinds of like imaginative kinds of things, you don't think about those barriers. And then you suddenly see that the things where that was the campus that was so beautiful, and the campus space that was looking so open, and suddenly full of barriers if you are taking from that position. Recently also happened that my mother got paralytic attack and things, and now suddenly for her this whole life has come to the kinds of like very orthopedic kinds of things. So everything is about her movement, everything is about things. Otherwise that those barriers were not there for her, like it was like very much you're operating in a very general and kinds of normative kinds of condition, and suddenly you are getting this attack, and this whole notion of barrier has completely changed. So I think, yeah, of course, that way you are talking about. And of course, I think Fanon, the way Fanon describes about, because he also comes from medical background, and he very much like, when he talks about these kinds of corporeal organization of the politics, then he's trying to bring some of those points that you are talking about, and the way he's trying to like talk about either orthopedic politics or like that kinds of politics, that is very much. Mm, mm, mm. Negotiating, yeah, 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 yeah.
yes, please.
Is this fine? Hello? Yeah. No, Brahma, you were asking, did it make sense? It made a lot of sense, and uh,
It's not clear, very clear.
Okay, I'll speak loudly. So it made a lot of sense for all of us and opened up possibilities, not only academically, but what more creatively to reflect on uh, the values and also the emergence of creative thinking, vision, criticality from the points of curtailment, as I said. I was thinking of an exceptional situation of the protest. And in the last few, you have written extensively about the situation, but political protest, as we know, in the public sphere is an exceptional. And there, a lot of these movements and politics protest happens in already established pathways that are designated for us to move around. And sometimes these also break. We create new spaces, we create new pathways, we jump the fences, we jump the park, we do different things. But despite all that, we go back to the old. After the exception is over, we go back to the old pathways, old systems of navigation, and again relying on the old. This is what I feel even what I see because Shafi pathways. Yeah. We see the emergence of amazing makeshift libraries, cooking, all these things happen. Again, like JNU, like bringing it back because it's like the kind of lectures and all that, tests and all that. But again, Shaheen Bagh in different parts, not only here, but the models, the protests that happen across, modeling on Shaheen Bagh in different parts of India itself. But also rooting for this new way of imagining the public sphere, new way of imagining the corporeality in the public sphere, in terms of not only protesting, but also articulating dissent, also imagining the possibilities of a discursive space, discuss, debate, and present, display, like the waving of the flags and all the nationalistic gestures, which was also done. But at the end of it, it's again to return. Then you return to.
Yeah, so thank you. Yeah, so I don't think I have very definitive answer for these things. But again, I think even we are talking about some kinds of return, we are talking about a journey that has already happened, that has been already performed. So when we are talking about some kinds of return, then you have already gone through some kinds of experiences, and therefore that is already marked somewhere. Maybe that is not getting reflected, but again, either we are talking about Sahibags, maybe women went back to their home household again, like the people who participated in protests, they also went back to their own spaces, but something is already marked, the journey has already happened, and I think in that journey the experiences, new experiences have already been created and encoded. So there are two ways in which perhaps we can talk about these questions. One is that yes, there is a return, and return also says about some kinds of some kinds of, so for example, you have return of the barricades time and again in very different forms. So recently I was thinking about encampments and how these encampments are getting created, Palestinian encampments are getting created across the world, and largely students, they are again creating a barricades around, and it is through the barricades they are able to create encampments. So barricades are now coming in very new ways, but again it also carries the sense of barricades. So I think in that return to that old also, I think some journey has already happened, and if that journey has taken place, happened, then I think something has been already been added. So either we are talking about we can talk about Una strike, we can talk about protest, and I think that some newness and something has been already added to that kinds of history. And I can give one example from Una strike. So for example, when we used to talk about a strike, it was largely like the workers' notion of a strike in a more organized kinds of setup. But again, Una strike did something remarkable. It was a strike that was in a very, one can say that was in a strike in a very working class sense. It was a strike, but it was also a strike. Yeah, oh, sorry, yeah, sorry. Yeah, so Una strike was a strike that was a very again, very short-lived strike that happened in India in 2016. And it was, the context was that the Dalit communities, 4 Dalit youths. Dalits are like, considered like a quote unquote untouchable communities in India. So they were like, flogged by police, by like some upper caste youths, and they recorded this video and circulated as a part of some kinds of pride. But again, that like, also like, later later the communities also protested in a massive ways, and in which they were doing something interesting. So one, that they were organizing some kinds of a strike, but one that we can talk about Una strikes in a, like, very general strike that one can talk about in terms of working class context. But it was also a strike that was trying to strike the very chord of like, divinity. So for example, in that strike, they were trying, like these protesters were trying to throw cow carcasses at administrative offices, at other places in our streets and things. So one, that like, they were very much trying to block the road and do that kinds of a strike, but it was also a strike at the very divine level. So how it is getting, a strike is getting now culturally context, like, it is making a lot of culturally meaningful context. So a strike was very universal in that sense, but also here in that sense of Pune strike, what is happening, that a strike was able to make more meaningful context, more impactful kinds of things, because it was also a strike at a divine level. And therefore, like, so how, like, so what I'm trying to say, that the journey, since the journey has already happened, some experience have already been added to the communities, and therefore this whole idea about, like, protest has failed, kya hua protest mein, to kuch hua nahi, fail ho gaya. But since you have already participated in protest, something has already happened, and that would be a kind of like.
I'm just kind of confused, but I'm confused. What's the answer that I think you all can say about values and rights. So, something that may produce radical, creative or aesthetic outcome. For instance, to write a poem not to few words, you write in that particular chapter, you have to follow or write in any of the forms, like right within that. You have to limit already have given in that, right? Then you have to produce in that what is the, so you cannot use language in order to the limit you use the language to produce. So in that sense, the confinement actually also kind of forces us to think every word more carefully. Because there are a different number of words within which you have to create, rhythms within which you have to create something. So that limit sometimes really forces us to think about each expression, idioms, each words more carefully. So in that sense, actually, that limit produces more intensity than sometimes the three words. It may allow us to express whichever way that you are just. Where you cannot think about the uniqueness of the word, the the the, the subversion of the word, and so on. If you apply that into the social world, it's a problem. In the sense that definitely I agree with all of that, a certain kind of confinement restrictions, a child mentally unstable who was physical disability, so you need some kind of confinement, temporary confinement, and sometimes a longer confinement is necessary to, it is a protective confinement. Yeah. Now that confinement that, the nation also can claim that. Nation is actually kind of doing it to protect the larger healthy body of the nation. So the same argument can actually kind of used, because they are actually kind of telling people not to enter the city because of the greater health of nation that you are doing. So my point is that what I'm saying is that Dr. Benjamin had this very interesting essay called Critique of Violence. Yeah. In that, Benjamin makes very distinction between multiple kinds of violence.
Divine violence.
Divine violence and state violence and so on and so forth. The next, there's we have this tendency of always saying that violence is condemnable. All violence are equally bad. All religious principles equally bad. It's minority or majority doesn't matter. All has to be condemned. So what he has been trying to do there is that he's actually producing a different understanding about the notion of violence. The violence that somebody used to resist, a violence actually inflicted by the state. Do we weigh both the violence the same thing? Say that both are equally condemnable? The same problem I see here. So even though I understand what you are trying to say, and I over date, the data start. It's like from the elementary to the best possible aesthetic.
Yeah.
So there, the confinement at least for me, it was very powerful. Because it is the power of the oppressed. It is the kind of violence that they inflict into the language, into the flourishment of the language. There it works for me. But on the other hand, if you reverse that into the state barricade and the other barricade, you collapse this distinction. You mean what happens is that the state strains are actually also equally justifiable. Why the single board of the barricade? Because the capital flow will disrupt. They enter into the cities, into the capital city, and so on and so forth. So it is for the greater health of the nation and so on. So I think we have to be careful about understand the more rhetoric and more using it. But I think there is a slight danger in polluting this. I don't think you need to pollute it.
Yeah.
I felt like.
Yeah, so maybe just, yeah. Yeah, so I think, yeah, so you're right. Like that way, I also agree that many times it reads like that you are trying to romanticize that whole notion of the barriers or notion of the barricades or some kinds of like, distancing and things like that. But also I think that key, and I would quite agree with you that in kinds of like, for example, in Bhojpuri kinds of song, like, I will give you another example. So you have like, this whole like Bhojpuri migrants, they went to Caribbean countries and they keep singing about some kinds of sadness of migration. So they keep singing, all the songs is about that, how much I miss the land and things. But the condition of the land is that the people who have stayed back, they're really in a bad situation. But again, even if you are in a good situation, now you are like I will say well placed in a kinds of very international kinds of scenario, then also keep harking back to that kinds of like things and thinking about that kinds of sadness, and that becomes one emotion. So one that we can talk about some kinds of social migrants, that is very empirical facts that comes with the economic reality and things, and another is the cultural migration that constantly keep generating these kinds of sadness. So precisely what I'm trying to say that here when I'm talking about barriers, one first condition is that not to romanticize or celebrate the notion of the barriers, but at the same time, how artist is going to work. If you're going to the kinds of artistic paradigm, then precisely this flatness, I'm afraid of like two things that I was perhaps could not elaborate much. One is the flatness that like becomes many more time, okay, love without risk, art without confrontation, like protest without like so you want to have protest but without like getting attacked by the state. And so that becomes very like flatness of the concept itself, and it's somewhere erase the radicality of those kinds of assemblies. And therefore, and second is the very positivist thinking, like so one is the flatness, second is the positivist thinking, and third would we can say that the situation is already there. One, that not necessarily when I'm saying that let us like try to defend these barriers, then I'm trying to create the new notion of the barriers, but the barriers are already there. And how to think about possibilities when you already have so many barriers. and therefore that is the way I would say. So maybe like categories are not that clear, or the distinction is not that clear, but necessarily how to like not to play, but how to navigate into these kinds of contradiction where this is very much there. And finally, you have like very famous, I will say, parable or essay by I think French, like Kafka. Yeah, Kafka. It's called Great Wall of China. So he gives like very interesting example where he's also talking about some distance and barriers. He says that there was a whole like every side they were trying to create these walls from like half of the laborers were coming from that side, others were coming from that side, and then we're not sure that whether the wall is already created or not. But by the time the authority has announced that okay, now it is constructed, it is done. So it is done. But he also gives example of that how like every time you can cross it. Nomads can cross it, others can cross it, other can cross it. So I'm saying that how these things are still operating. One, that you have very sense of the wall, that you can say that its wall barriers are already created, but it is within the barriers that you are able to create something, you are able to make a crossovers, and that is the way I would like to end it here.
Yeah, thank you so much.